Kang-Ho had been waiting for this day his entire life, counting down the years, months, and finally the hours until he would turn 18 years old and receive his magic job just like everyone else in his world. In the place where Kang-Ho lived, turning 18 was not just about becoming an adult or getting a driver's license like in some other worlds. Instead, it was the single most important moment in any person's entire existence because on that special birthday, the universe itself would reach down and grant each person a magical job that would define who they were and what they could do for the rest of their lives. Some people became powerful warriors who could swing swords made of lightning, while others became brilliant mages who could summon storms from their fingertips or healers who could mend broken bones with just a touch of their glowing hands. The job you received determined everything about your future, including how much money you would make, what kind of house you would live in, who your friends would be, and even whether other people would respect you or look down on you with pity in their eyes. On the morning of his 18th birthday, Kang-Ho woke up before the sun had even started to peek over the horizon, his heart hammering in his chest like a drum being played by an excited musician. He had barely slept the night before because his mind kept racing with possibilities and dreams of what kind of amazing job he might receive. He imagined himself as a dragon knight, soaring through the clouds on the back of a massive scaled beast that breathed fire hot enough to melt mountains, or perhaps he would become an elemental master who could control fire, water, earth, and air all at the same time with just a thought. His mother had made him his favorite breakfast of sweet rice cakes and warm soup, but Kang-Ho could barely eat a single bite because his stomach was doing flips and somersaults from the nervousness and excitement that filled every corner of his body. His father patted him on the shoulder and told him that no matter what job he received, they would be proud of him. But Kang-Ho could see the hope shining in his father's eyes that his son would receive something powerful and respected. The awakening ceremony took place in an enormous stadium that could hold tens of thousands of people, with stone walls that reached so high into the sky that the tops seemed to touch the clouds themselves. Families filled the seats, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, chattering excitedly and pointing down at the field where hundreds of 18-year-olds stood in neat rows, all waiting for their turn to step forward and receive their destiny. Giant magical screens floated in the air above the stadium so that everyone could see exactly what was happening, displaying each person's name and the job they received in letters as tall as a house. One by one, the young people stepped onto a raised platform made of pure white marble that seemed to glow with its own inner light. When each person stood in the center of that platform, a beam of golden light would shoot down from the sky, surrounding them completely, and then words would appear in the air announcing their new job to the entire world. Kang-Ho watched as his classmates received job after incredible job, each one seeming more amazing than the last. A girl named Min-Seo became a sacred priestess, a job so rare and powerful that only one appeared every 100 years, and the crowd roared with applause so loud that it hurt Kang-Ho's ears. A boy he used to play with in elementary school became a sword saint, which meant he would be able to cut through steel like it was made of soft butter and move so fast that normal people would only see a blur. Another friend received the job of Grand Alchemist, giving her the ability to create potions that could heal any disease or make a person strong enough to lift a car over their head. Each time someone received a good job, their family would jump up and down in the stands, hugging each other and crying tears of pure joy, while the person on the platform would raise their fists in the air triumphantly as golden light swirled around them like a beautiful tornado. Finally, Kang-Ho's name echoed through the stadium, amplified by magic so that every single person could hear it clearly no matter where they were sitting. His legs felt like they were made of jelly as he walked toward the platform, his hands shaking so badly that he had to clench them into fists to try to make them stop. He could feel thousands and thousands of eyes watching him, and he said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening that he would receive something good, something that would make his parents smile and let him hold his head up high. He stepped onto the platform and felt the cold marble beneath his feet, smooth and perfect and ancient beyond imagining. The golden light began to descend from the sky, warm and tingly against his skin, wrapping around him like a gentle blanket made of pure sunshine. He closed his eyes and held his breath, waiting for the moment that would change his life forever. The light faded away, and Kang-Ho opened his eyes, looking up at the massive floating screen that would display his job for everyone to see. His heart sank into his stomach like a stone dropping into a deep, dark well when he saw the words that appeared in huge, glowing letters that seemed to mock him with every flicker. Level 1 Grave Digger. Those 4 words might as well have been a death sentence in a world where your job determined your value as a human being. The stadium, which had been filled with excited chatter and celebration just moments before, fell completely silent, so quiet that Kang-Ho could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears like thunder. Then, after what felt like an eternity of horrible silence, someone in the crowd started to laugh, a cruel, sharp sound that cut through the air like a knife. That single laugh opened the floodgates, and suddenly thousands of people were laughing, pointing their fingers at Kang-Ho and shaking their heads in disbelief and pity and amusement at his terrible misfortune. Kang-Ho felt his face burning red with shame so intense that he thought he might actually catch on fire from the embarrassment of it all. He looked desperately toward where his 2 best friends were standing among the other young people who had already received their jobs, hoping to see some sympathy or support in their faces, some sign that they still cared about him despite his worthless job. But his friends, who he had known since he was 5 years old, who he had shared his lunch with and played games with and told his deepest secrets to, looked at him with disgust and quickly turned away, walking in the opposite direction as fast as they could without actually running. They did not want anyone to know that they had ever been friends with someone as pathetic as a level 1 grave digger, because being associated with him might damage their own reputations and futures now that they had received respectable jobs of their own. The government officials who ran the awakening ceremony gave Kang-Ho a sealed envelope containing his assignment and told him in cold, emotionless voices to report to the monster graveyard on the outskirts of the city the very next morning. They did not look him in the eyes when they spoke to him, treating him like he was already invisible, already less than human because of the job he had received. Kang-Ho stumbled off the platform, his vision blurry with tears that he refused to let fall, because he did not want to give the laughing crowd the satisfaction of seeing him cry, and he walked out of the stadium alone while everyone else celebrated with their families and took pictures to remember this glorious day. His parents tried to comfort him when he got home, telling him that he could still live a good life and that there was dignity in all honest work, but their voices sounded hollow and sad, and Kang-Ho could see the disappointment swimming in their eyes even though they tried desperately to hide it from him. The monster graveyard was located far outside the city, beyond the tall walls and protective magical barriers, in a place where the ground was always damp and smelled like rotting leaves and old death. It was a massive field that stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction, filled with countless graves where the bodies of defeated monsters were buried after brave hunters killed them in dungeons and brought their corpses back to be disposed of properly. When Kang-Ho arrived on his first day of work, a tired-looking supervisor handed him a rusty old shovel that was nearly as tall as he was and pointed toward an enormous pile of monster corpses that needed to be buried, telling him to get started and not to expect any help from anyone because gravediggers worked alone. The supervisor explained that monsters continued to be dangerous even after death because their bodies could release poisonous gas or attract even more dangerous creatures if left out in the open, which is why they needed to be buried deep underground where their corruption could be sealed away from the living world. Kang-Ho stared at the mountain of dead monsters before him, feeling smaller and more hopeless than he had ever felt in his entire life. There were goblins with their twisted green faces frozen in permanent snarls, giant wolves the size of horses with their fur matted with dried blood, and creatures he could not even name that looked like they had crawled out of nightmares with too many teeth and limbs bent at impossible angles. The smell was absolutely horrific, making his eyes water and his stomach churn with nausea, but he had no choice except to start working because this was his job now and forever, the thing that would define him for the rest of his life. He picked up his shovel and began to dig, his muscles aching and protesting with every scoop of heavy, wet earth, his hands quickly developing painful blisters that burst and bled and formed again as he worked hour after hour under the gray, cloudy sky that perfectly matched his mood. Days turned into weeks, and Kang-Ho fell into a miserable routine of digging grave after grave after grave, his entire body becoming one giant bruise of pain and exhaustion. He worked from sunrise until long after sunset, until his hands bled and his back screamed in agony and his legs trembled so badly that he could barely walk back to the tiny, cold shack that served as his living quarters at the edge of the graveyard. He ate simple meals of rice and vegetables alone, with no friends to talk to and no one who cared whether he lived or died out here in this forgotten place where failure was sent to be buried along with the monsters. But despite how horrible everything was, despite how much he wanted to give up and lie down in one of the graves he had dug and never get up again, Kang-Ho made a decision deep in his heart that he would not let this job defeat him completely, that he would work as hard as he possibly could and find some small amount of pride in doing his terrible job well even if no one else would ever notice or care. On a day that seemed no different from any other, Kang-Ho was struggling to bury an absolutely massive ogre that had been killed by a team of high-ranking hunters and dumped at the graveyard like garbage. The creature was easily 3 times as tall as a normal man and weighed probably as much as a small car, with muscles that bulged grotesquely even in death and skin that was tough as leather, making it incredibly difficult to maneuver its enormous corpse into the deep pit Kang-Ho had spent all morning digging. He had to use ropes and leverage and every bit of strength his exhausted body could muster to finally roll the ogre into its grave, and then he began the back-breaking work of shoveling dirt on top of it, one heavy load at a time, his lungs burning and his vision going spotty from the extreme physical effort. Just as Kang-Ho dumped what felt like the 1,000th shovelful of dirt onto the ogre's massive body, something absolutely impossible happened that would change the course of his entire life forever. A blue screen suddenly appeared right in front of his face, floating in the air like a window made of pure light, covered in glowing text that he could read as clearly as if it were written on paper right in front of his nose. Kang-Ho jumped backward in shock, nearly falling into the grave himself, and blinked his eyes several times to make sure he was not hallucinating from exhaustion or going crazy from loneliness and despair. But the screen did not disappear no matter how many times he blinked or rubbed his eyes with his dirty, bleeding hands. The text on the screen congratulated him for completing a hidden quest that apparently no one else in the entire history of gravediggers had ever managed to complete before, a quest that required burying exactly 100 creatures with his own hands without giving up or running away despite how horrible the work was. The notification explained that, as a reward for his dedication and hard work and refusal to surrender to despair, he had been granted something called the God Architect System, a power so rare and special that it existed completely outside the normal rules of jobs and levels that governed everyone else in the world. Kang-Ho's hands were shaking as he reached out to touch the floating blue screen, and the moment his fingertips made contact with the glowing surface, he felt something like electricity surge through his entire body, starting at his hands and racing up his arms and spreading through his chest and down into his legs and all the way to the tips of his toes. Information began flooding into his mind, knowledge appearing in his thoughts as if it had always been there, explaining exactly what his new system could do and how it would completely transform him from the weakest person in the world into something that no one could possibly imagine. The God Architect System had one simple but incredibly powerful ability that made Kang-Ho's heart start racing with excitement for the first time since his terrible awakening ceremony. Every single time he buried something, anything at all, whether it was a tiny goblin or an enormous dragon, the system would absorb the strength and abilities of that creature and transfer a portion of that power directly into Kang-Ho's own body and mind. The more he buried, the stronger he would become, with absolutely no limit to how powerful he could grow as long as he kept working and kept digging and kept filling graves with the bodies of defeated monsters. While everyone else in the world had to risk their lives fighting in dangerous dungeons and training for years and years to increase their strength by even a single point, Kang-Ho could become stronger simply by doing the job that everyone had laughed at him for receiving, the job that was supposed to be a curse but had actually turned out to be the greatest blessing anyone could possibly receive. Another notification appeared on the blue screen, this one showing numbers and statistics that made Kang-Ho's eyes go wide with disbelief and wonder. The system informed him that by burying the massive ogre, he had just gained 50 points of strength all at once, which was an absolutely insane amount considering that most people trained for months just to increase their strength by 1 or 2 points. Kang-Ho could actually feel the change happening in his body, a sensation that was both strange and wonderful at the same time, like his muscles were being rebuilt from the inside out, the fibers becoming denser and more powerful with every passing second. His arms, which had been thin and weak and covered in bruises, suddenly seemed to swell slightly, new muscle appearing where there had only been skin and bone before, and when he picked up his shovel again it felt as light as a feather in his hands when just minutes ago it had felt like it weighed 100 pounds. More changes began happening as the system continued to integrate with his body and mind, changes that Kang-Ho could feel but also somehow see in his thoughts, as if part of his brain had turned into a screen that displayed his own statistics and abilities. His mind felt sharper and clearer than it had ever been before, thoughts that used to be slow and muddled now moving at lightning speed, connections and ideas forming instantly that would have taken him hours to figure out in the past. The constant pain that had been his companion for weeks, the aching in his back and the burning in his muscles and the throbbing in his blistered hands, all of it faded away like fog disappearing in the morning sunlight, replaced by a feeling of energy and vitality that made him want to jump and shout with joy even though there was no one around to hear him. Kang-Ho spent the next several minutes just staring at his hands, opening and closing his fingers and watching the way his new muscles moved beneath his skin, still hardly able to believe that this was really happening to him and not just some desperate dream his exhausted mind had created to escape from his miserable reality. He picked up a rock that was half buried in the mud, a rock that he knew from experience weighed at least 30 or 40 pounds, and he lifted it over his head with one hand as easily as if it were made of foam, laughing out loud at the pure absurdity and wonder of it all. The system sent him another notification, reminding him that this was only the beginning, that every single grave he dug from this point forward would make him stronger and faster and smarter, that his power would grow exponentially as he buried more and more powerful creatures, and that there was literally no limit to how strong he could become if he just kept working. With renewed energy and purpose burning in his chest like a fire that could never be extinguished, Kang-Ho turned back to his work with an enthusiasm he had never felt before, seeing the piles of monster corpses not as a burden but as opportunities, each one a chance to grow stronger and prove to everyone who had laughed at him that they had made a terrible mistake. He worked through the rest of the day and long into the night, digging and burying and feeling his power increase with each completed grave, the numbers on his internal status screen climbing higher and higher until he had to stop and catch his breath not from exhaustion but from the sheer excitement of watching himself transform. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting silver light across the graveyard that suddenly did not seem quite so scary or lonely anymore, Kang-Ho was digging a particularly deep grave for a giant serpent when his shovel struck something hard hidden beneath the mud and rotting leaves. He cleared away the dirt carefully, his enhanced strength making the work go much faster than it ever had before, and he discovered what appeared to be a stone door built directly into the earth itself, covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight with a soft blue luminescence that matched the color of his system screens. The door was enormous, easily 10 feet tall and just as wide, made of some kind of dark gray stone that felt warm to the touch despite having been buried underground for who knows how many years or decades or maybe even centuries. Kang-Ho's heart began to pound with a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he traced his fingers over the mysterious symbols, and his system suddenly activated without him asking it to, sending him a new notification that made his breath catch in his throat. The message explained that he had discovered a hidden ancient dungeon that had been lost and forgotten long before anyone currently alive had even been born, a place filled with both incredible dangers and unimaginable treasures, and that as the first person to find it in countless years, He now had the exclusive right to explore it and claim whatever lay waiting in the darkness beyond that ancient stone door. Kang-Ho stood before the massive stone door for what felt like an eternity, his hand resting on the warm surface as his mind raced with possibilities and fears about what might be waiting on the other side. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat, and he could feel a strange energy emanating from beyond the door, like the breath of something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping for thousands of years. His new strength from the God Architect system made him feel braver than he had ever felt before, and after taking one deep breath to steady his nerves, he pressed both hands against the door and pushed with all the enhanced might his transformed body could produce. The door, despite looking like it weighed several tons and had not moved in centuries, swung open smoothly and silently as if it had been waiting specifically for him to arrive at this exact moment in time. Beyond the doorway was not the cramped tunnel or small cave that Kang-Ho had expected to find, but instead an absolutely enormous underground space so vast that he could not see the ceiling or the far walls even when he squinted his eyes and strained to peer into the darkness. As he stepped through the threshold, torches suddenly burst into flame all along the walls, lighting up one after another in a chain reaction that spread out in both directions and revealed something so incredible that Kang-Ho had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling over in shock. Spread out before him was an entire city, a massive ancient metropolis built completely underground with buildings made of stone and marble that rose several stories high, with streets paved in smooth cobblestones that formed intricate patterns, with grand staircases and beautiful fountains that had long since run dry and plazas large enough to hold thousands of people. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs that showed no one had walked these streets in more years than Kang-Ho could even begin to imagine. But despite the age and abandonment, the city remained hauntingly beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with a feeling he could not quite name. His system screen flickered to life in front of his eyes, providing him with information about this incredible discovery in text that scrolled across the glowing blue surface. The notification explained that this was the Necropolis of Kings, a sacred burial city constructed in an age so ancient that it existed before the modern job system had even been created, back when magic worked differently and people gained power through completely different means than they did in the world Kang-Ho knew. This was a place where the greatest rulers and warriors and wise men of that forgotten era had been laid to rest, their bodies preserved in elaborate tombs along with all their possessions and knowledge, sealed away from the world above so that their spirits could find peace in the eternal darkness. The system told him that everything in this city now belonged to him by right of discovery, and that the treasures and power contained within these ancient walls could transform him into something far beyond what anyone in the modern world could possibly comprehend. Kang-Ho began to walk slowly down the main street of the dead city, his footsteps echoing off the stone buildings in a way that made him feel incredibly small and alone despite all the power he had gained. Dust rose in small clouds with every step he took, floating through the air like tiny ghosts dancing in the torchlight. He passed by buildings that must have been shops or homes once upon a time, their windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of skulls, their doors hanging open or rotted away completely to reveal rooms filled with furniture that had turned to dust and pottery that had cracked and crumbled with age. The deeper he went into the city, the more grand and impressive the architecture became, with buildings decorated with intricate carvings showing battles between warriors and monsters, and statues of stern-faced kings wearing crowns and holding scepters, their stone eyes seeming to follow Kang-Ho as he passed by them on his journey toward the heart of this underground realm. At the center of the city stood the largest building Kang-Ho had ever seen, a palace or temple constructed of pure white marble that seemed to glow with its own internal light even after all these centuries buried in darkness. Wide steps led up to massive pillars that supported a roof decorated with faded paintings of stars and moons and suns, and between these pillars was an entrance that looked like the open mouth of some great beast waiting to swallow him whole. Kang-Ho climbed the steps slowly, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and a strange kind of reverence, feeling like he was approaching something holy and important that demanded respect even from someone like him who had been treated as worthless trash by the world above. Inside the temple, he found row after row of stone coffins and burial chambers, each one sealed with heavy lids carved with the names and deeds of the person resting within, written in an ancient script that Kang-Ho found he could somehow read perfectly even though he had never studied this language in his life. He walked past the tombs of kings who had ruled vast empires and queens who had been renowned for their wisdom and justice, past the resting places of court magicians who had commanded the elements and generals who had never lost a single battle in their entire careers. But it was a smaller, simpler tomb in a quiet corner of the temple that called to Kang-Ho with a pull he could not resist, drawing him toward it like a magnet attracts iron. The coffin was made of plain gray stone with no elaborate decorations or boastful inscriptions, marked only with a single symbol that looked like a sword crossed with a flower, elegant in its simplicity. When Kang-Ho placed his hands on the heavy lid and pushed it aside with his new strength, he found himself looking down at a skeleton dressed in the rotted remains of what must have once been simple traveling clothes, with no crown or jewels or treasure, just old bones and a small metal plaque that identified the remains as belonging to the Sword Saint of the Azure Sky, a title that made Kang-Ho's breath catch because even in the modern world, stories were still told about this legendary master, who was said to have been able to cut moonlight itself with his blade. Kang-Ho felt a deep sadness looking at these forgotten bones, thinking about how this person who had been so skilled and famous had ended up alone in this dark place with no one to remember them or honor their grave. Using his shovel with a gentleness and care he had never shown before, he carefully gathered the ancient bones and carried them outside to a beautiful spot in the city square where a large tree had somehow managed to grow despite being underground, its branches covered in glowing silver leaves that provided the only natural light in this realm of eternal night. He dug a proper grave with his own hands, making it deep and straight and perfect, and he laid the bones to rest with the kind of dignity and respect that every person deserved regardless of how long they had been dead. As he filled in the grave and patted down the earth on top, speaking words of thanks to this unknown master for their service in a time long past, his system screen suddenly exploded with lights so bright and golden that he had to shield his eyes. Notification after notification flooded his vision, the text scrolling so fast that he could barely read it all, explaining that by properly honoring and burying a legendary master of the sword, he had completed another hidden quest and earned a reward beyond anything the normal system would ever grant. The God Architect system had absorbed not just the strength but the complete knowledge and skill of the Sword Saint of the Azure Sky, downloading decades worth of training and experience and muscle memory directly into Kang-Ho's brain and body in a matter of seconds. He could feel it happening, feel his mind filling with information about stances and forms and techniques, about how to read an opponent's movements and when to strike and how to turn defense into offense in the blink of an eye. His muscles began to remember movements he had never actually performed, his hands twitching and flexing as if they had held a sword for years when in reality the only weapon he had ever wielded was his rusty old shovel. Acting on pure instinct and newly implanted knowledge, Kang-Ho picked up his shovel and began to move through the forms and techniques that now existed in his mind as if they had always been there. The shovel, a simple tool meant for digging dirt and nothing more, became an extension of his body as he spun and slashed and thrust with perfect precision and grace. He moved like water flowing downhill, like wind passing through trees, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next without any wasted energy or awkward transitions. He could see in his mind's eye how to defeat enemies that did not exist, how to counter attacks that were not being thrown, how to move in ways that would make him nearly impossible to hit while simultaneously putting his opponents in positions where they had no choice but to fall before his strikes. When he finally stopped, breathing hard but not from exhaustion but from pure exhilaration, he realized that he had somehow become a master swordsman without ever actually holding a real sword, and he started laughing at the absolute absurdity and wonder of it all. Kang-Ho spent the next several hours exploring every corner of the underground city, going through tombs and burial chambers and sealed vaults with the eagerness of a child opening presents on their birthday. In the pockets of royal robes that had turned to dust at his touch, he found small leather pouches containing seeds that somehow remained perfectly preserved despite the countless years they had been sealed away from sun and rain. His system identified them as celestial growth seeds, magical plants from the ancient era that could only be cultivated by someone with mana flowing through their veins, plants that produced fruits and vegetables with properties that could enhance a person's body and mind in ways that modern food could never achieve. Kang-Ho found a patch of dark, rich soil in what must have been a royal garden once upon a time, and he planted the seeds carefully, spacing them out properly and covering them with earth just like his grandmother had taught him to do in her small vegetable garden when he was a little boy. The moment the seeds were fully buried, Kang-Ho felt his system activate automatically, and he watched in amazement as his mana, a resource he barely understood and had never consciously used before, began to flow out of his body and into the ground like invisible water being poured from an invisible cup. The soil began to glow with a soft green light, and before his very eyes, tiny sprouts pushed up through the earth and began to grow at a speed that should have been completely impossible. In just minutes, the sprouts became seedlings, and the seedlings became full-grown plants heavy with fruits and vegetables that glowed with different colored lights, each one pulsing with concentrated magical energy that Kang-Ho could actually see swirling inside them like little galaxies contained within skin and flesh. His system helpfully labeled each plant, telling him which ones would increase strength, which ones would sharpen the mind, which ones would improve speed or endurance or magical capacity. Kang-Ho reached out with a shaking hand and plucked a fruit that looked like an apple but glowed with an intense golden light that hurt to look at directly, its surface smooth and perfect and radiating warmth like a tiny sun. The system notification that appeared told him this was a fruit of ascension, something so rare and valuable that kings in the ancient world had gone to war over a single one, and that eating it would cause his level to increase dramatically in a single instant rather than requiring the months or years of hard work that normal people needed to level up. He bit into the fruit without hesitation, and the moment the sweet juice touched his tongue, he felt like he had been struck by lightning made of pure liquid gold. The sensation was not painful, but it was incredibly intense, like every cell in his body was being lit on fire and remade into something better and stronger and more than it had been just a second before. The magic from the fruit raced through his veins like a river that had broken through a dam, surging and rushing and flooding every part of him with power that made his previous strength feel like nothing in comparison. Kang-Ho could feel his muscles growing denser and harder, could feel his bones becoming stronger and less likely to break, could feel his heart beating more powerfully and his lungs expanding to hold more air with each breath. His mana reserves, which had been small and weak like a tiny puddle, suddenly expanded into a vast ocean of energy that he could draw upon whenever he needed it. But the changes were not just physical. His mind became sharper and clearer than he had ever imagined possible, able to process information and make decisions at speeds that made his old way of thinking seem like trying to run through thick mud. Notification after notification appeared on his system screen, numbers climbing higher and higher, telling him that he had jumped from level 1 all the way to level 25 in a single instant, an achievement that should have been completely impossible and would have taken a normal person years of constant fighting and training to accomplish. While Kang-Ho was experiencing this incredible transformation deep underground in his secret city, the world above was facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything and everyone in it. A massive fire dragon, a creature of legend that had not been seen in over 100 years, had appeared in the sky above the capital city without any warning, its scales burning red like molten metal, and its wings so enormous that they blocked out the sun when it flew overhead. The beast breathed flames hot enough to melt stone and metal, setting entire neighborhoods ablaze with single blasts of its terrible breath, and its roar was so loud and terrifying that people collapsed in the streets just from hearing it. The government immediately called forth all their strongest heroes, the same powerful individuals who had received amazing jobs at their awakening ceremonies, the ones who were supposed to protect society from exactly this kind of threat. The sacred priestess Minseo tried to use her holy magic to create barriers that would protect the civilians, but the dragon's flames were so hot that her shields cracked and shattered like glass after only a few seconds. The sword saint who had received his job at the same ceremony where Kang-Ho had been humiliated swung his enchanted blade with all his might, sending waves of cutting energy toward the dragon. But the attacks bounced off the creature's scales without leaving even the smallest scratch. The grand alchemist threw every powerful potion she had created, explosions of ice and lightning and poison, but the dragon simply flew through them all as if they were nothing more than annoying insects buzzing around its head. One by one, the great heroes of the modern age were being defeated and driven back, their confidence turning to fear and then to panic as they realized that despite all their power and training and fancy jobs, they were completely helpless against this ancient monster. Deep in his underground city, Kang-Ho had discovered a chamber containing a large pool of water that was perfectly still and clear like a mirror made of liquid. When he looked into its surface, instead of seeing his own reflection, he saw images of the world above, the system explaining that this was a scrying pool that ancient rulers had used to watch over their kingdoms and keep track of what was happening in distant lands. Kang-Ho watched the battle between the dragon and the heroes with a strange feeling in his chest, seeing the same people who had laughed at him and called him worthless now struggling and failing and looking weak and pathetic as they were thrown around by the dragon like toys being tossed by an angry child. He saw his former best friends cowering behind rubble, their faces twisted with fear, all their arrogance and pride stripped away by the reality of facing a truly powerful enemy. He saw the crowds of people who had mocked him now screaming and running for their lives, realizing too late that fancy jobs and high levels meant nothing if you did not have the actual strength to back them up when it really mattered. Kang-Ho did not feel happy seeing them suffer, but he also did not feel particularly sad or worried about them either. His emotions complicated and mixed as he watched the city that had rejected him burn under dragon fire. Part of him thought about going up there to help, using his new strength and skills to fight the dragon and save people who had treated him like garbage. But another part of him, a harder and colder part that had been created by all the loneliness and pain and humiliation he had endured, whispered that they deserved this for how they had treated him, that it would serve them right to understand what it felt like to be helpless and weak and looked down upon. He turned away from the scrying pool, leaving the images of destruction behind, and walked back toward the garden where more magical fruits were ripening and waiting to make him even stronger, thinking that perhaps the world above could take care of itself for a while longer while he focused on becoming powerful enough that no one would ever be able to laugh at him or make him feel small ever again. The fire dragon circled above the burning city like a massive predator playing with its food before going in for the final kill, its enormous wings creating gusts of wind so powerful that they knocked people off their feet and sent debris flying through the air like deadly missiles. Flames dripped from its jaws like glowing saliva, each droplet setting fire to whatever it touched, and the creature's eyes burned with an ancient hatred that suggested it did not just want to destroy the city, but wanted to make everyone in it suffer as much as possible before they died. The streets were filled with screaming people running in every direction, parents clutching their children and elderly people stumbling over rubble, while the so-called heroes who were supposed to protect them lay scattered across the battlefield, their bodies broken and their spirits crushed by the overwhelming power of this legendary beast that belonged to an era when monsters were truly terrifying and not just things that could be farmed for experience points in managed dungeons. Among the defeated heroes was a gold-rank knight named Tae-sung, a young man who had been in the same awakening ceremony as Kang-Ho and had received the prestigious job of Holy Paladin, which had made him instantly famous and respected and given him access to the best training and equipment that money could buy. Tae-sung had been one of the people who had laughed the loudest when Kang-Ho's pathetic job was announced to the entire stadium, and in the weeks that followed, whenever their paths had crossed in the city, Tae-sung had gone out of his way to make cruel jokes about grave diggers and to remind Kang-Ho of his place at the very bottom of society's ladder. He had pushed Kang-Ho in the streets, knocked food out of his hands in the market, and encouraged others to treat him like he was invisible or worse than invisible, like he was something disgusting that people should avoid touching or even looking at directly. Tae-sung had felt powerful and important, making someone else feel small, never imagining that there might come a day when he would be the one who was helpless and afraid. Now that Gold-rank Knight lay pinned under a collapsed wall, his expensive enchanted armor cracked and smoking from dragon fire. One of his legs twisted at an angle that made it clear the bone was broken in multiple places. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead, mixing with tears that he could not hold back no matter how hard he tried because the pain was too intense and the fear was too overwhelming. He could see the dragon descending toward him, could see its mouth opening wider and wider as it prepared to release another blast of flames that would turn him into nothing more than ash and blackened bones. Tae-sung screamed for help, his voice breaking with terror and desperation, calling out to anyone who might be able to save him even though he knew that all the other heroes had already been defeated, and that there was no one left who was strong enough to stand against this monster. He thought about his parents and his younger sister and all the dreams he had for the future, all the things he would never get to do now, and he closed his eyes because he could not bear to watch his own death approaching on wings of fire. Just as the dragon's throat began to glow with the terrible light that meant flames were about to erupt from its mouth, something impossible happened that made every person who was watching gasp in shock and disbelief. The ground directly beneath the dragon's massive body, solid stone that had been part of the city street for hundreds of years, suddenly turned soft like quicksand, and then opened up completely into an enormous hole that appeared in less than a second. The dragon, caught completely by surprise in the middle of preparing its attack, let out a roar of confusion and anger as it dropped into the pit, its wings flapping frantically but unable to generate enough lift to pull its huge body back up before gravity dragged it down into the darkness below. The ground shook with the impact of the dragon hitting the bottom of the pit, and dust and smoke billowed up from the hole like a volcano erupting in reverse, filling the air with a thick gray cloud that made it impossible to see what was happening. Out of that smoke and dust walked a figure that nobody recognized at first, a young man wearing simple worker clothes that were covered in dirt and old stains, clothes that looked like they belonged to someone who did manual labor rather than someone who fought monsters and saved cities. But there was something about the way he moved, a quiet confidence and power in every step, that made people stop screaming and running and instead turn to stare at the stranger who had appeared from nowhere. As he came closer and the smoke cleared around him, people could see his face more clearly, and some of them started to whisper in confusion because he looked familiar in a way they could not quite place, like someone they had seen before but in a completely different context that their minds were struggling to connect to this moment. It was his eyes that truly captured everyone's attention, glowing with an intense purple light that seemed to look right through people and see into their very souls. Eyes that held power and knowledge and something ancient that should not exist in someone so young. Kang-Ho did not say a single word as he walked calmly through the destroyed street, his shovel resting on his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. His glowing purple eyes scanning the area and taking in the wounded heroes and terrified civilians with an expression that revealed nothing about what he might be thinking or feeling. People could sense the power radiating from him like heat radiating from a fire, an overwhelming presence that made the air itself feel heavy and charged with energy, and instinctively they moved out of his way even though he had not asked them to or made any threatening gestures. The heroes who were still conscious enough to notice his arrival felt something inside them react to his presence, their own much smaller amounts of power recognizing that they were in the vicinity of someone who operated on a completely different level than they did, like mice suddenly realizing they were in the same room as a sleeping lion. Tae-sung, still trapped under the rubble and barely clinging to consciousness, watched through pain-blurred eyes as this mysterious figure approached, and his heart sank even deeper when he finally recognized who it was beneath the dirt and the glowing eyes and the aura of impossible power. It was Kang-Ho, the pathetic grave digger who Tae-sung had mocked and bullied and treated like human garbage, except this person did not look pathetic at all anymore but instead looked like something out of an ancient legend, like a hero from the old stories that people told around fires about warriors who could move mountains and split the sky. Tae-sung wanted to say something, wanted to apologize or beg for help or ask what had happened to transform the weakest person in the world into someone who radiated power like the sun radiated light, but his throat was too dry and his voice would not work no matter how hard he tried to make sound come out. Kang-Ho stopped at the edge of the massive pit he had created, looking down at the dragon that was thrashing around at the bottom and trying to climb back up the smooth walls, its claws scraping against stone but finding no purchase. He raised his simple shovel high above his head with both hands, the tool catching the light and somehow looking less like a piece of digging equipment and more like a legendary weapon that had been passed down through generations of heroes. Then, with a motion that seemed almost casual despite the incredible force behind it, he brought the shovel down and slammed it into the ground with a sound like thunder that rolled across the entire city and made buildings shake on their foundations. The street beneath everyone's feet cracked and split, glowing purple lines of light spreading out from where Kang-Ho stood like a spider web made of pure energy. And from those cracks something began to emerge that made everyone who saw it question whether they were actually awake or if this was all some kind of fever dream brought on by terror and smoke inhalation. Skeleton hands pushed up through the cracks in the street, bony fingers gripping the edges of the breaks in the pavement and pulling bodies up from whatever impossible place they had been summoned from. One by one, skeleton warriors climbed out of the ground, each one fully formed and wearing beautiful silver armor that gleamed even though it was covered in grave dirt. Each one carrying weapons that ranged from swords and spears to axes and shields, all of them moving with a precision and purpose that made it clear these were not mindless undead shambling around randomly but were instead a disciplined army that remembered how to fight and follow orders. Within seconds there were 10 skeletons standing at attention. Then 20, then 50, then 100, all of them perfectly still and silent as they waited for commands from the person who had called them forth from their eternal rest. The people watching from the damaged buildings and from behind overturned cars could not believe what they were seeing, could not comprehend how the gravedigger who everyone had dismissed as the weakest and most useless person in the entire world was now standing in the middle of a destroyed street surrounded by an army of undead warriors that he had apparently summoned with a single strike of his shovel. Even the injured heroes, people who were supposed to be familiar with magic and powerful abilities, had never seen anything like this because the modern job system simply did not grant this kind of power to anyone, let alone to someone with a job as lowly as gravedigger. The skeleton soldiers began to move without Kang-Ho saying a word out loud, suggesting that he was giving them orders telepathically or through some kind of connection that existed between a summoner and his creations, and they moved with the coordinated efficiency of a professional military unit that had trained together for years. Half of the skeleton army spread out across the area, positioning themselves between the civilians and any potential danger, their shields raised and their weapons ready to defend the people who moments ago had been completely helpless against the dragon's assault. The other half of the undead warriors rushed toward the pit where the dragon was still trying to escape, and they began to work together in a way that showed tactical intelligence that should have been impossible for creatures without flesh or brains. Some of them used ropes that appeared from nowhere to create a net across the top of the pit, while others positioned themselves around the edge with long spears pointed down at the dragon, and still others began to pile heavy stones and debris onto the net to weigh it down and prevent the dragon from simply smashing through it with brute force. The dragon roared and breathed fire upward, melting some of the skeleton soldiers into puddles of molten metal and scorched bone. But the moment one fell, another would step forward to take its place, the army showing no fear because they were already dead and had nothing left to lose. Kang-Ho walked calmly to the edge of the pit, looking down at the trapped dragon with those glowing purple eyes that seemed to see everything and judge everything they saw. The dragon, realizing that this small human was somehow responsible for everything that was happening, turned its full attention to Kang-Ho and unleashed a blast of fire so intense that the very air around it seemed to catch flame, a killing blow that should have reduced any person to atoms in a fraction of a second. But Kang-Ho did not dodge or put up a shield or show any sign of fear at all. Instead, he simply raised his shovel and held it in front of him like a barrier, and the dragon fire split around him without touching him, flowing past on either side like water flowing around a rock in a river, leaving him completely untouched and unharmed while the street behind him melted and bubbled from the heat. When the dragon's flames finally stopped, leaving the creature panting and exhausted from the effort of producing such a powerful attack, Kang-Ho moved with a speed that should not have been possible for a human being. One moment he was standing at the edge of the pit, and the next moment he was somehow at the bottom standing right in front of the dragon's enormous head, his shovel pulled back and ready to strike. The dragon's eyes went wide with what might have been fear or might have been confusion, unable to understand how something so small and weak-looking had moved so fast that even its supernatural senses could not track the movement. Kang-Ho swung his shovel with both hands, putting all of his enhanced strength behind the blow, and the simple metal tool connected with the dragon's skull right between its eyes with a sound like a bell the size of a mountain being struck by a giant's hammer. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the air that shattered windows and buildings blocks away, and the dragon's head snapped back so hard that its long neck bent at an angle that looked painful even for a creature as large and tough as a legendary fire dragon. The beast's eyes rolled back in its head, showing only white, and its massive body went limp and crashed to the ground, sending up another cloud of dust and making the entire pit tremble from the weight. For a moment, everything was completely silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. Then a system notification appeared in the air above Kang-Ho's head, but unlike the private notifications that only he could normally see, this one was visible to everyone watching, floating in the sky in letters of blazing gold that were 10 feet tall and impossible to miss or ignore. The notification congratulated Kang-Ho on defeating a world boss, a creature so powerful and rare that the entire world was supposed to band together to fight it, explaining that he had accomplished alone in minutes what should have required hundreds of high-level heroes working together for hours or days. The rewards listed on the notification made people gasp out loud in shock and envy, starting with 10,000 gold pieces, which was enough money to buy a mansion in the nicest part of the city and still have plenty left over, along with rare items and equipment that most people would never see in their entire lives. But the most impressive reward was the title that appeared last, the words seeming to glow even brighter than the rest of the text, naming Kang-Ho as the savior of the people and granting him benefits and bonuses that would make him even more powerful than he already was. The crowd that had been watching from their hiding places began to emerge, moving cautiously at first and then with growing confidence, as they realized the dragon was truly defeated and the danger had passed. They stared at Kang-Ho with expressions that mixed awe and confusion and gratitude and shame. Shame because many of them recognized him now and remembered how they had treated him, remembered laughing at his terrible job or ignoring him when he walked past or making jokes at his expense. Tae-sung, finally freed from the rubble by some of the skeleton soldiers who had gently lifted the debris off him with a care that seemed almost mocking given how he had treated their master, looked at Kang-Ho with tears still streaming down his face. But now they were tears of humiliation and regret rather than tears of pain and fear. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to apologize or to thank Kang-Ho for saving his life despite everything Tae-sung had done to hurt him. But before any words could come out, Kang-Ho turned away as if the gold rank knight was not even worth acknowledging. Without saying a single word to anyone, without waiting for thanks or praise or recognition for what he had done, Kang-Ho began walking back toward the pit he had emerged from. His skeleton army dissolving into purple smoke and flowing back into the ground like they had never existed at all. People called out to him, asking him to wait, asking who he was and where he had gotten such incredible power and whether he would help protect the city from future threats. But Kang-Ho did not respond to any of them or even turn his head to show that he had heard their questions. He reached the edge of the pit and simply stepped off, falling into the darkness below, and the earth closed up behind him as if it had never been opened in the first place, leaving behind only cracks in the pavement and scorch marks from dragon fire as evidence that any of this had actually happened. The crowd stood in stunned silence, looking at the spot where their mysterious savior had vanished, realizing that the person they had called worthless trash had just saved all their lives and then disappeared without asking for anything in return, without even giving them the chance to say thank you or to admit that they had been wrong about him from the very beginning. After the battle with the fire dragon, Kang-Ho had returned to his underground city through a network of tunnels he had created with his earth-controlling powers, and he sat in the throne room of the ancient palace counting the 10,000 gold pieces that had materialized in his inventory as a reward for saving the city above. The gold coins shimmered with a magical light of their own, each one perfectly round and stamped with symbols from the modern government, and there were so many of them that they formed a pile as tall as Kang-Ho himself when he dumped them all out onto the marble floor. He ran his fingers through the coins, listening to the pleasant clinking sound they made, and he thought about what he should do with this incredible wealth that had been dropped into his lap. Most people would have bought a fancy house in the city or expensive clothes or magical weapons, but Kang-Ho had no desire to go back to the place where people had mocked him and made him feel worthless, and besides, he had discovered that he quite enjoyed being alone with his thoughts and his system and the silent company of the ancient dead who asked nothing of him except to be treated with respect. Looking through the listings that merchants posted on magical bulletin boards that could be accessed from anywhere through his system interface, Kang-Ho found something that immediately caught his attention and made him smile for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was a mountain for sale, a huge piece of land located far from any major city, a place that had been on the market for years and years because absolutely nobody wanted to buy it no matter how low the price dropped. The mountain was called Cursed Peak by the locals who lived in the villages at its base, and it had a reputation for being haunted by angry spirits and dangerous monsters that killed anyone foolish enough to try to climb its slopes or explore the dark forests that covered it like a thick blanket. The listing explained that at least a dozen different buyers had purchased the mountain over the past century, each one planning to develop it or mine it or build something on it, and every single one of them had either died under mysterious circumstances or fled in terror after experiencing things they refused to talk about even when offered large sums of money for their stories. Kang-Ho read through the warnings and the stories of disappearances and the reports of strange lights and sounds coming from the mountain at night, and instead of being scared or worried, he felt excited because this sounded exactly like the kind of place where he could be left alone to do whatever he wanted without nosy neighbors or government inspectors bothering him every 5 minutes. He used almost all of his gold to purchase the entire mountain and all the land surrounding it for hundreds of miles in every direction, signing the magical contracts that transferred ownership and placed protective barriers around the borders that would keep out anyone who did not have his permission to enter. The merchant who sold him the property looked at Kang-Ho like he was absolutely insane, warning him repeatedly that people who went to Cursed Peak tended not to come back. But Kang-Ho just smiled politely and thanked the man for his concern before teleporting directly to his new home using a travel gate that his system had unlocked as one of the benefits of his Savior of the People title. The mountain was even more perfect than Kang-Ho had imagined from reading the listing, rising high into the clouds with jagged peaks covered in snow that never melted even in summer, its slopes thick with ancient trees that grew so close together that barely any sunlight reached the forest floor. The air smelled clean and fresh, completely different from the polluted smell of the city or even the musty smell of his underground realm, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the calls of birds and the distant roar of waterfalls cascading down cliff faces. Kang-Ho stood at the base of his mountain and felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for so long that he had forgotten it was there, and he realized that this was the first place since receiving his terrible job where he actually felt like he could breathe properly and be himself without worrying about what other people thought or how they were judging him. He spent the first week just exploring his new territory, hiking up and down the slopes and discovering caves and clearings and streams filled with fish that had probably never seen a human being before. His system helped him map out the entire mountain in 3 dimensions, creating a detailed model in his mind that showed him every rock and tree and animal burrow, and he began to plan what he would build and where he would build it. Using his God Architect system's power to control earth and stone, Kang-Ho started the most ambitious construction project anyone had attempted in generations, deciding that if he was going to live on this mountain then he was going to do it in a style that matched the power he had gained and the respect he deserved even if the world refused to give it to him. He summoned hundreds of skeleton workers, Not the armored warriors from the battle, but instead skilled craftsmen and builders whose bones he had found in the underground city, ancient masters of architecture and engineering who had built palaces and temples in an age when magic and construction were considered the same art. Day after day and night after night, Kang-Ho and his army of undead workers labored on the mountain, reshaping the very stone of the peaks and moving earth in quantities that would have required thousands of normal workers using modern machinery. They carved directly into the mountain itself, hollowing out the interior and creating vast halls and chambers connected by spiraling staircases and elegant corridors. And on the outside they constructed towers and walls and balconies that seemed to grow naturally from the rock, as if the mountain had always been meant to look this way. The castle that emerged from their efforts was more beautiful than anything that existed in the modern world, combining the ancient architectural wisdom of the Forgotten Era with improvements and flourishes that Kang-Ho designed himself, guided by the knowledge his system provided and by his own growing sense of what looked right and impressive. The walls were made of white marble shot through with veins of gold that caught the sunlight and made the entire structure glow like it was lit from within. And the windows were tall and arched and filled with glass so clear and perfect that it was almost invisible. Kang-Ho did not stop with just building a castle, because he wanted his mountain to be completely self-sufficient and not dependent on anything from the outside world that had rejected him. Using the magical knowledge he had absorbed from the ancient kings buried in the underground city, he began to modify the very nature of the plants and trees growing on his mountain, pouring his mana into their roots and changing them on a fundamental level until they became something new and impossible. He created trees whose fruits, when squeezed, produced not juice but actual healing potions that could cure diseases and mend wounds, trees whose leaves could be brewed into teas that granted temporary increases to strength or speed or mental clarity. He planted gardens where vegetables grew to enormous sizes and contained concentrated nutrients that made a single meal as filling and energizing as 3 normal ones. He even modified some of the flowers to glow softly at night, turning his entire mountain into a landscape of gentle lights that looked like something from a fairy tale when viewed from a distance. News of the mysterious changes happening on Cursed Peak began to spread through the nearby villages and eventually reached the cities beyond, carried by travelers and merchants who reported seeing lights on the mountain and hearing the sounds of construction echoing down from the heights. Rumors started to circulate about vast wealth being stored on the mountain, about magical treasures and piles of gold, just waiting to be taken by anyone brave or foolish enough to venture into the supposedly haunted territory. A group of greedy hunters, men and women who made their living robbing and stealing from others rather than earning money honestly through dungeons or jobs, heard these rumors and decided that they would be the ones to claim whatever riches were hidden on Cursed Peak. They were all high-level fighters with good equipment and powerful skills, and they laughed among themselves about how easy it would be to take everything from whoever was living up there, especially since the rumors said it was just a single person, probably some eccentric hermit who had gotten lucky and found an ancient treasure but would not know how to defend it properly. The hunters approached Cursed Peak late at night, thinking that darkness would help them sneak in without being detected, and they crossed the boundary of Kang-Ho's territory with weapons drawn and greed burning in their hearts. They had barely taken 10 steps past the invisible property line when they realized that something was very wrong with this mountain, that it did not follow the normal rules that governed how land and nature were supposed to work. The path they had been following suddenly was not there anymore, replaced by thick bushes and fallen logs that definitely had not been there a second ago, and when they turned around to go back the way they had come, they found that the way back had changed too, leading in a completely different direction than it should have. The mountain itself was moving and shifting around them like a living maze, paths appearing and disappearing, clearings that had been to their left suddenly appearing to their right, the entire landscape rearranging itself to confuse and disorient anyone who did not have permission to be there. The hunters tried to use their skills and magic to navigate through the changing terrain, but every trick they attempted was countered by something even more clever that Kang-Ho had built into his mountain's defenses. When they tried to climb trees to get a better view and figure out which direction to go, the trees themselves came alive and grabbed their weapons right out of their hands with branches that moved like arms, dropping the swords and bows into hidden holes in the ground where they disappeared forever. When they tried to cut their way through the forest with magical fire, the plants absorbed the flames and grew even thicker and taller, creating walls of vegetation so dense that not even light could pass through. When they tried to dig underground to bypass the surface obstacles, they found that the earth itself refused to move for them, staying hard as steel no matter how much they dug or what tools they used. From his comfortable seat on a wide balcony that jutted out from the highest tower of his castle, Kang-Ho watched the struggling hunters through his system's surveillance feature, which showed him everything happening anywhere on his property as clearly as if he were standing right next to them. He was sitting in a chair he had carved from a single piece of ancient oak, sipping juice made from his magical healing fruits, the sweet liquid cool and refreshing in his mouth, and he could not help but smile at how pathetic these supposedly tough hunters looked as they stumbled around his mountain like confused children lost in a forest. His system kept sending him notifications in the corner of his vision, little messages that popped up every few minutes telling him that his defense level was increasing as the mountain's traps activated and proved their effectiveness, that his territory control was getting stronger as the land learned to recognize and repel intruders automatically without him even having to think about it. Kang-Ho let the hunters wander in circles for several hours, watching them get more and more tired and frustrated and scared, watching them start to turn on each other and argue about whose fault it was that they had gotten trapped and whether they should try to keep going forward or try to retreat. Only when they were completely exhausted and had given up all hope of finding any treasure or even finding their way out did Kang-Ho finally take direct action, using his earth manipulation powers to create a path that led the hunters straight to his castle gates. They stumbled out of the forest looking like they had been through a war, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces scratched by branches, their pride thoroughly destroyed by the experience of being toyed with by a mountain that seemed to have a mind of its own. Standing at the gates to greet them was Kang-Ho himself, though the hunters did not recognize him because they had never paid attention to a lowly gravedigger and had no idea what he looked like. He stood there in simple work clothes with his shovel resting on his shoulder, his purple eyes glowing softly in the darkness, and he looked at the would-be thieves with an expression that showed he was not angry but rather disappointed, like a teacher catching students cheating on a test. He told them in a calm, quiet voice that they had trespassed on his property with the intention of stealing from him, and that the punishment for this crime would be to work in his gardens for 1 month, tending the magical plants and learning the value of honest labor instead of trying to take things that did not belong to them. The hunters started to protest and make threats, but when Kang-Ho snapped his fingers and 100 skeleton warriors emerged from the shadows surrounding them with weapons drawn and ready, they very quickly changed their attitudes and agreed that working in the gardens sounded like a perfectly reasonable punishment actually. In the cities and towns far below the mountain, people began to talk about the strange events happening on Cursed Peak with a mixture of fear and fascination. The hunters who had tried to rob the mountain eventually returned to civilization after serving their month of punishment, and they told wild stories about a ghost king who lived in a castle more beautiful than anything built by mortal hands, a mysterious figure who could control the very earth and summoned armies of the dead and made plants grow by magic. News reporters and government officials tried to investigate these claims, sending scouts and drones to observe the mountain from a distance, and they captured images of the glowing castle and the impossible gardens and the skeleton workers moving around like they were alive. The whole world started buzzing with speculation about who this ghost king might be, with theories ranging from a returned ancient emperor to a powerful new monster that had claimed the mountain as its territory to an eccentric billionaire using advanced technology to create illusions. Nobody, not a single person in all the discussions and debates and news programs that talked endlessly about the mystery of Cursed Peak, ever suggested that the ghost king might be Kang-Ho, the boy who had awakened as a level 1 gravedigger and been laughed at by an entire stadium. Why would they even think to make that connection when everyone knew that gravediggers were the weakest and most pathetic job in existence? When the last anyone had heard of Kang-Ho, he had been sent away to bury monsters in a lonely graveyard on the edge of civilization. The world had already forgotten about him completely, dismissed him as unimportant and not worth remembering, and Kang-Ho found that he preferred it that way, preferred to be left alone on his beautiful mountain where he could grow stronger and build whatever he wanted without anyone judging him or trying to tell him what he could or could not do. He sat on his balcony every evening watching the sunset paint the sky in colors of orange and pink and purple, drinking his magical juice and listening to his system tell him about all the ways his power continued to grow, and he felt more at peace than he had ever felt in his entire life, finally understanding that he did not need the approval or recognition of people who had never seen his true value in the first place. One morning while Kang-Ho was walking through the forest on the eastern slope of his mountain, checking on some new fruit trees he had planted the day before, he noticed something unusual about a particular patch of ground beneath an ancient willow tree whose branches hung down like a curtain of green leaves. The earth there looked disturbed in a way that was different from the natural settling of soil, with a slight depression that suggested something might be buried underneath, and his system suddenly activated without him asking it to, displaying a notification that said there were human remains detected 3 feet below the surface in that exact spot. Kang-Ho's curiosity was immediately sparked because he had thoroughly explored his entire mountain and had never found any graves or burial sites, which meant that whoever was buried here had been placed in this spot a very long time ago, probably centuries before the mountain had gained its reputation for being cursed and haunted. Using his shovel and his earth manipulation powers working together, Kang-Ho carefully excavated the area, moving the dirt aside with a gentleness that came from months of practice burying things properly and respectfully. What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat because this was not just a random skeleton or the remains of some unfortunate traveler who had died on the mountain long ago. The body was perfectly preserved despite obviously being ancient, wrapped in black cloth that had been treated with some kind of magical solution that prevented decay, and the person had been buried with tools and equipment that Kang-Ho recognized from the knowledge he had absorbed from the underground city as belonging to a shadow operative, a type of spy and assassin that had served the ancient kings in secret and had been so skilled at their work that most people did not even believe they had really existed. The body was positioned in a specific way with hands crossed over the chest and face pointing toward the sunrise, which according to the old customs meant this person had died while on an important mission and had requested that their body be hidden where enemies would never find it. Kang-Ho knew from experience that burying someone with the proper respect and ceremonies would often trigger his god architect system to grant him rewards, and he wondered what he might gain from laying to rest someone who had clearly been important and skilled in their time. He dug a new grave in a beautiful spot on his mountain where the view stretched for miles and where morning sunlight would warm the earth, and he carefully transferred the preserved body to its new resting place, speaking words of honor and thanks for the service this unknown person had provided to their king and country so many years ago. As he filled in the grave and patted down the earth on top, his system screen exploded with golden light even brighter than it had been when he buried the legendary sword master, and notifications began flooding his vision so fast that he could barely keep up with reading them all. The God Architect system informed him that he had completed another extremely rare hidden quest by discovering and properly burying a master shadow operative, one of only 7 such individuals who had ever existed in the entire history of the ancient world. As a reward, the system was transferring not just the skills but the actual memories of this person directly into Kang-Ho's mind, giving him access to everything the spy had seen and learned and experienced during their long and secret-filled life. Kang-Ho gasped and fell to his knees as information began pouring into his brain like water from a broken dam. Images and sounds and feelings that were not his own but felt as real and vivid as if he had lived through them himself. He saw through the eyes of the shadow operative as they moved invisibly through palace halls and enemy camps, as they gathered intelligence and eliminated targets and served their king with absolute loyalty and dedication that went far beyond what any normal soldier could offer. Among all these memories, one in particular stood out with such clarity and importance that it seemed to glow brighter than all the others, demanding Kang-Ho's attention and making his heart start to pound with a growing sense of horror and disbelief. The memory showed the shadow operative on what would turn out to be their final mission, infiltrating a secret meeting that was taking place in a hidden location deep underground. A meeting so important and dangerous that the operative knew they might not survive the attempt to witness it. Through the spy's eyes, Kang-Ho watched as powerful figures gathered around a circular table, their faces hidden by magical masks that prevented identification, and they discussed a plan so evil and monstrous that the operative's hands had trembled with rage, even as they remained perfectly hidden in the shadows, taking mental notes of everything being said. The leaders at that secret meeting were discussing how to maintain their power and control over the common people, how to make sure that they remained at the top of society while everyone else struggled and suffered below them. One of the masked figures, someone whose voice the shadow operative recognized as belonging to someone very high up in the government even though they could not see the face, proposed a solution that made everyone else at the table lean forward with interest. This person suggested that they should secretly summon monsters from other dimensions and release them into the world in controlled amounts, creating just enough danger and chaos that people would be afraid and would turn to their leaders for protection and would be willing to give up their freedoms and their money and their trust in exchange for safety. The monsters would be manageable, not strong enough to actually destroy civilization but strong enough to keep people scared and dependent, and the leaders would position themselves as heroes fighting against this threat even though they were the ones who had created the threat in the first place. Kang-Ho watched through the spy's memory as the masked figures agreed to this terrible plan, as they signed contracts written in blood and sealed with dark magic, as they created the system that would eventually lead to the modern world where monsters appeared from dungeons and people awakened to jobs at age 18, and the whole structure of society was built around fighting threats that should never have existed in the first place. The shadow operative had tried to escape and report what they had learned to their king, but they had been discovered before they could get away, and the last thing in their memory was the feeling of poison entering their bloodstream and the desperate hope that somehow, someday, someone would find their body and learn the truth about the corruption at the heart of the world. The memory ended abruptly, leaving Kang-Ho kneeling on the ground with tears streaming down his face. Tears of anger and betrayal and a bone-deep fury that made his whole body shake. Everything he had been taught about the world was a lie. Every story about brave heroes fighting against the monster threat was built on a foundation of deception and manipulation, and the people who were supposed to be protecting humanity were actually the ones responsible for all the death and suffering and fear that monsters had caused over the generations. Kang-Ho thought about all the families who had lost loved ones to monster attacks, about all the children who had grown up as orphans, about his own miserable awakening ceremony and the terrible job he had received, and he wondered how much of it had been planned and controlled by the people at the top who benefited from keeping everyone else weak and desperate and divided. The rage burning in his chest was like nothing he had ever felt before, hot and righteous and demanding that something be done about this injustice, that the truth be revealed and the guilty be punished for their crimes against all of humanity. Along with the memories, Kang-Ho had also inherited the shadow operative skills and abilities, and his system showed him a long list of new capabilities that had been added to his character sheet in glowing text. The most useful of these new skills was something called Shadow Walk, an ability that allowed him to merge with darkness itself and become completely invisible and undetectable to any form of magic or technology or even divine sight. The skill did not just make him hard to see but actually removed him from normal reality temporarily, placing him in a state between dimensions where he could observe everything happening around him but could not be touched or sensed by anyone no matter how powerful they were. Kang-Ho tested the skill immediately, activating it with just a thought, and he watched his own body fade away like smoke dispersing in the wind until he could not even see his own hands when he held them up in front of his face. An idea began to form in Kang-Ho's mind, a dangerous and bold plan that made perfect sense given what he had just learned and the new abilities he had just gained. If the leaders of the world were corrupt and evil and hiding terrible secrets, then he needed to gather evidence and find out exactly who was involved and how deep the conspiracy went before he could decide what to do about it. The memory had shown him one face clearly even though most of the others had been hidden, the face of the current president who was known throughout the world as the hero president, a man who had supposedly saved humanity countless times and who everyone trusted and admired and looked up to as the greatest champion of justice and righteousness. Kang-Ho needed to confirm that this president was really the same person from the ancient conspiracy, needed to find proof that could not be denied or explained away, and the only way to do that was to go directly into the heart of enemy territory and see what secrets were being kept in the most secure and protected places in the entire world. Using his shadow walk skill, Kang-Ho traveled from his mountain to the capital city in a matter of hours, moving through the darkness like a ghost that left no footprints and made no sound, passing through the magical barriers and security checkpoints that were supposed to keep out intruders as if they did not even exist. The capital was exactly as he remembered it from the few times he had visited before his awakening ceremony. A gleaming metropolis full of tall buildings and flying vehicles and people rushing around looking important and busy. He passed through streets where he had once walked and felt small and worthless, but now those same streets seemed tiny and insignificant, the buildings that had once looked so impressive now appearing like toys to his enhanced perception, and the people who had once intimidated him now looking like ants scurrying around without any real understanding of how the world actually worked. Kang-Ho made a detour on his way to the president's headquarters, curiosity pulling him toward the elite academy where the most talented and powerful young people were sent to receive advanced training after their awakening ceremonies. He slipped invisibly through the academy gates and wandered the halls where his old classmates now studied. The same people who had received good jobs and bright futures while he had been sent away to dig graves in lonely places. He found them in training rooms and classrooms, and he watched as they practiced their skills and bragged to each other about their accomplishments, talking about how they had defeated level 5 monsters, or learned a new spell, or increased their stats by a few measly points. They seemed so proud of themselves, so confident and self-satisfied, but to Kang-Ho, who had defeated a world boss dragon and built a castle with his bare hands and absorbed the knowledge of ancient masters, they looked pathetic and weak, like children playing at being warriors without any understanding of what real power actually meant. He saw his former best friends among the students, the ones who had abandoned him immediately after his terrible awakening, and they were laughing and joking with new friends who had replaced him as if he had never existed at all in their lives. Kang-Ho felt nothing looking at them, no anger or sadness or desire for revenge, just a kind of distant pity for people who would probably never understand how small and limited their lives really were. He left the academy behind without a second thought and continued on to his real destination, the presidential palace that sat in the very center of the capital city, surrounded by walls and guards and magical defenses that were supposed to make it the most secure location on the entire planet. Getting inside was almost laughably easy for someone with Kang-Ho's skills and abilities, and he walked right past guards who stared straight at the spot where he was standing without seeing anything unusual, past magical sensors that should have detected any unauthorized presence but remained silent because he technically was not even present in the same dimension as the equipment. He made his way through corridor after corridor, following a mental map that his system provided based on the shadow operative's memories of similar buildings from the ancient era, until he found what he was looking for hidden behind a secret door concealed in the president's private office. The door led to a vault built with the strongest magic and the thickest metal, designed to keep out anyone who did not have the specific key and authorization code. But Kang-Ho simply walked through the solid wall as if it were made of mist and found himself standing in a room full of treasures and artifacts that had been stolen or hidden away from the public eye. There were weapons and armor from legendary heroes of the past, books containing forbidden knowledge that the government had decided was too dangerous for ordinary people to know about, and piles of gold and jewels that represented wealth beyond what most people would see in 100 lifetimes. But the thing that immediately caught Kang-Ho's attention was a diamond sitting on a pedestal in the center of the room. A gem the size of a human head that glowed with a pure white light and radiated such intense power that even looking at it made Kang-Ho's eyes water. His system analyzed the diamond and sent him a notification that made his hands start shaking with excitement and disbelief, explaining that this was the heart of the divine, an artifact from the Age of Gods that contained enough concentrated holy energy to resurrect a deity who had died or been sealed away, one of the most powerful and valuable objects in existence and something that should never have been kept hidden in a private vault where only one corrupt man could control its use. Kang-Ho did not hesitate for even a second before reaching out and taking the diamond, his system absorbing it directly into his inventory where it could not be tracked or detected by any means. Alarms should have started blaring the moment he touched it, magical defenses should have activated to trap or kill him, but because he was operating in the shadow dimension, nothing responded to his presence at all. Before leaving, Kang-Ho decided to send a message to the president, something that would let the corrupt leader know that his secrets were no longer safe, and that someone was watching him who could not be stopped by normal security measures. Using a small knife and a piece of wood he found in the vault, Kang-Ho carved a tiny shovel, making it as detailed and perfect as he could in just a few minutes of work, and he placed this wooden carving in the exact center of the president's desk where it would be the first thing the man saw when he returned to his office. Kang-Ho left the presidential palace the same way he had entered, invisible and undetectable, and he made his way back to his mountain home with the stolen diamonds safely stored in his inventory, and a smile on his face thinking about how confused and afraid the president would be when he discovered that someone had broken into his most secure vault and left behind nothing but a tiny wooden shovel as a calling card. The journey back gave Kang-Ho time to think about everything he had learned and what he should do with this dangerous knowledge, whether he should reveal the truth to the world immediately or wait and gather more evidence first, whether he should confront the president directly or work from the shadows to dismantle the corrupt system piece by piece. He did not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty as he climbed back up his mountain and looked out over the land that now belonged to him, a land where he made the rules and where he answered to no one but himself and his own sense of what was right and wrong. The people who had called him worthless and laughed at his terrible job had no idea that the real loser was not the gravedigger they had dismissed, but rather the entire corrupt world they had built on lies and maintained through fear, and Kang-Ho was going to enjoy watching that world crumble when the truth finally came to light. Kang-Ho had spent weeks training and growing stronger on his mountain, burying every powerful creature he could find and absorbing their strength through his god architect system until his level had climbed higher and higher with each passing day. He had gone from level 25 to level 50 in just 2 weeks by burying an entire pack of lightning wolves that had been terrorizing a nearby village, and then from level 50 to level 75 by discovering and properly laying to rest the remains of an ancient giant whose bones were scattered across a frozen wasteland 300 miles north of his territory. Each level brought not just increases to his basic statistics like strength and speed and magical power, but also new abilities and deeper understanding of how his unique system worked, how the act of burial was not just about putting bodies in the ground but was actually a sacred ritual that connected the living world to the realm of death and allowed him to serve as a bridge between those two places. By the time he reached level 95, Kang-Ho had become something far beyond what any normal human could achieve. His body filled with so much concentrated power that simply standing still caused the air around him to shimmer and warp like heat rising from hot pavement on a summer day. But despite all this incredible growth and all the strength he had accumulated, Kang-Ho felt like something was still missing, like he had not yet reached the true potential that his god architect system was trying to guide him toward. His system kept sending him hints and suggestions through notifications that appeared during his meditation sessions, cryptic messages that spoke about evolution and transformation, and reaching a higher state of being that would unlock abilities beyond anything he currently possessed. The system showed him visions of places he had never been, locations scattered across the world where incredibly powerful creatures had died and been left to rot because nobody else had the ability or the desire to give them proper burial, and one location in particular kept appearing in his dreams over and over again until he finally decided that he needed to go there and see what was waiting for him. The place was called the Valley of Dead Dragons, a remote and desolate canyon located in the far eastern reaches of the continent, where the land was nothing but cracked earth and jagged rocks under a sky that always seemed gray and overcast even on the sunniest days. According to the ancient records that Kang-Ho had read in the underground city library, this valley had been the site of a massive battle thousands of years ago during the final war between dragons and the combined forces of humans and other intelligent races. A conflict so terrible and destructive that it had literally reshaped the geography of the entire region and left scars on the land that would never fully heal. Hundreds of dragons had died in that valley, their massive bodies falling from the sky like meteors and crashing into the earth with such force that they created craters dozens of feet deep. And over the centuries their flesh had rotted away and their bones had been picked clean by scavengers until nothing remained but enormous skeletons bleached white by the sun and half buried in the sand and dust that blew constantly through the canyon. Kang-Ho traveled to the Valley of Dead Dragons using a combination of his shadow walk ability and a teleportation gate he had constructed on his mountain, stepping through a shimmering portal and emerging in the middle of a graveyard that stretched as far as his enhanced eyes could see in every direction. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, hundreds of dragon skeletons lying in poses that suggested they had fought until their very last breath, some with their jaws still open in silent roars and others with their wings spread wide as if they had been trying to take flight one final time before death claimed them. Kang-Ho walked slowly through the field of bones, feeling the weight of all this death pressing down on him like a physical force, and his system remained strangely quiet as if waiting for him to discover something important on his own without any hints or guidance. He searched the valley for hours, examining skeleton after skeleton and trying to understand what his system wanted him to find in this place of ancient tragedy, until finally he saw something in the distance that made him stop dead in his tracks and stare in absolute wonder and disbelief. Rising from the center of the valley like a mountain range made of bone was the largest dragon skeleton that Kang-Ho had ever seen or even imagined could exist, a creature so massive that its skull alone was the size of a 3-story building and its spine stretched out behind it for what looked like an entire mile or possibly even longer. This had clearly been the king or queen of all dragons, a being of such incredible size and power that it must have been able to swallow smaller dragons whole and level entire cities with a single beat of its wings. And even in death its presence radiated a kind of terrible majesty that made Kang-Ho feel small despite all the strength he had gained. His system finally activated again as he approached the colossal skeleton, sending him a notification that confirmed what he had already suspected deep in his heart. This was the Dragon Emperor, the oldest and most powerful dragon that had ever lived, the one who had led the dragon armies in their war against the other races and had single-handedly killed thousands of warriors before finally being brought down by a combined attack from 100 of the greatest heroes of that ancient age. The system explained that properly burying this creature would grant Kang-Ho a reward beyond anything he had received before, that it would trigger his final evolution and transform him into something that had never existed in all of history, but it also warned him that the task would be incredibly difficult and dangerous because moving and burying something this large would require him to push his abilities to their absolute limits and possibly beyond. Kang-Ho accepted the challenge without hesitation, knowing that this was exactly the kind of impossible task that he had been preparing for through all his training and growth. He began by summoning every skeleton worker in his army, calling forth thousands of undead laborers from the burial grounds scattered across his territory, and they appeared through portals and rose up from the earth itself to answer their master's command. Even with all these workers helping him, Kang-Ho knew that moving the Dragon Emperor's body would take days or even weeks of constant effort, and he threw himself into the work with a determination and focus that allowed him to forget about everything else in the world except the task in front of him. He used his earth manipulation powers to soften the ground around the massive skeleton, carefully excavating the bones that had been buried under centuries of accumulated dirt and sand, working with a gentleness that seemed almost absurd given the enormous scale of what he was doing but was necessary to avoid damaging these ancient remains that deserved to be treated with the utmost respect. The excavation took 3 full days and nights of non-stop work, with Kang-Ho and his skeleton army laboring under the sun during the day and by the light of magical torches during the night, pausing only when Kang-Ho needed to drink water or eat some of his magical fruits to restore his energy. Once the Dragon Emperor's skeleton was fully uncovered and lying exposed on the surface, Kang-Ho began the even more difficult task of digging a grave large enough to contain it, creating a trench that was a mile long and 100 feet deep and 50 feet wide, moving literally millions of tons of earth and rock to create a resting place worthy of the greatest dragon that had ever lived. His muscles screamed in protest and his bones ached from the constant physical effort, and several times he pushed himself so hard that he collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried back to a safe spot by his skeleton workers who watched over him with a loyalty and concern that seemed remarkable for creatures that were technically already dead. On the 7th day, the grave was finally complete, a massive trench that looked like a canyon within a canyon, and Kang-Ho carefully guided his skeleton workers as they used ropes and levers and platforms to lower the Dragon Emperor's bones into their final resting place with a precision and care that would have impressed even the most skilled engineers. When the last bone was in position and everything looked perfect, Kang-Ho dismissed his workers and stood alone at the edge of the grave, looking down at the skeleton that represented so much history and power and tragedy. He began to shovel dirt into the grave using his own 2 hands, refusing to use magic or helpers for this final sacred duty, and he worked steadily for hours as the sun moved across the sky and began to sink toward the horizon, filling in the massive trench one shovelful at a time while speaking words of honor and respect to the spirit of the great creature he was laying to rest. As Kang-Ho placed the final shovelful of earth on top of the Dragon Emperor's grave and patted it down gently, something incredible and terrifying began to happen that made him take several steps backward in shock and amazement. The sky above the valley suddenly turned completely black, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the sun, and clouds began to gather and swirl in patterns that suggested this was not a natural weather phenomenon, but rather some kind of response to what Kang-Ho had just accomplished. Lightning started to flash within the clouds, not the normal yellowish-white lightning of thunderstorms but instead bolts of pure golden energy that seemed to carry the concentrated power of the heavens themselves, and these bolts began to strike downward toward the valley floor with increasing frequency and intensity until the air itself was crackling with electricity and the smell of ozone. One massive bolt of golden lightning, larger and brighter than all the others combined, suddenly changed direction in midair and shot straight toward Kang-Ho with such speed that he did not even have time to try to dodge or defend himself. The lightning struck his shovel right where he was holding it, and instead of the terrible pain and death that should have resulted from being hit by such a powerful electrical discharge, Kang-Ho felt the energy flowing into his body like warm water filling an empty vessel, changing him on a fundamental level that went beyond just increasing his statistics or granting him new abilities. His system screen appeared in front of him and it was glowing so brightly that he had to squint to read the text, and the notifications that scrolled across the display were written in letters of gold and silver and spoke of transformation and evolution and the achievement of a state that had been thought impossible. The God Architect system announced that Kang-Ho had evolved into the Architect of the Afterlife, a title and power level that placed him beyond the normal hierarchy of jobs and classes, making him something closer to a god than to a human being. His new abilities were almost too numerous to list, but the most important ones were the power to see and communicate with every dead soul on the entire planet regardless of where they were or how long they had been deceased, the ability to resurrect the dead not as mindless zombies but as intelligent beings who retained their personalities and memories from life, and the authority to command death itself to obey his will and serve his purposes. The system explained that there had only ever been one other architect of the afterlife in all of history, and that person had been responsible for creating the boundary between life and death that kept the two realms separate and prevented the living and the dead from interfering with each other in ways that would destroy the natural order of existence. Even as Kang-Ho was trying to process and understand everything that had just happened to him, the ground beneath his feet began to shake and crack, and he watched in amazement as the Dragon Emperor's grave split open and something emerged that made his breath catch in his throat. The dragon rose up from the earth, but it was no longer just a skeleton of bleached white bones. Instead, the entire body was now wreathed in blue flames that burned without producing any heat, mystical fire that illuminated the creature from within and made it look like it had been carved from pure sapphire and starlight. The Dragon Emperor's eyes opened, revealing orbs of glowing blue that fixed on Kang-Ho with an intelligence and awareness that showed this was not some mindless undead servant, but was actually the original spirit of the great beast returned to the world and given form once again through Kang-Ho's power. The dragon bowed its enormous head to Kang-Ho in a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, and through the mental connection that now existed between them, Kang-Ho understood that this magnificent creature had accepted him as its master and would serve him faithfully in whatever battles or tasks lay ahead. But the Dragon Emperor was not the only dead soul responding to Kang-Ho's evolution, because his new ability to see and sense all the deceased on the planet had activated automatically, and his vision suddenly expanded to show him countless points of light scattered across the world, each one representing a spirit that had died but remained connected to the physical realm through unfinished business or violent deaths or simply the strength of their will to continue existing. He could see the spirits of warriors who had fallen in dungeons and never been properly honored, of monsters who had been killed and discarded without ceremony, of ancient heroes whose deeds had been forgotten by the living world, and he realized with growing excitement that all of these souls could potentially become part of his army if he reached out to them and offered them a chance to serve a purpose again. Kang-Ho spent the next several days using his new powers to call forth the dead from all across the world, summoning the spirits of thousands of skeleton knights who had served the ancient kings with honor and loyalty, gathering the ghosts of dragons who had died in the Great War and bringing them back in bodies made of colored flames just like the Dragon Emperor. His army grew larger and more powerful with each soul he resurrected, but strangely enough, they did not look scary or evil or like the monsters that people imagined when they thought about armies of the undead. Instead, his forces glowed with soft holy light that seemed to purify the air around them, and they moved with a grace and dignity that suggested they were protectors rather than destroyers, angels of death who had been given a second chance to serve justice and righteousness in a world that desperately needed both. Standing on a cliff overlooking his assembled forces, Kang-Ho looked down at an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, with skeleton knights in gleaming silver armor standing in perfect formations and dozens of flame dragons circling overhead in patterns that painted the sky with streaks of blue and green and purple light. He thought about the corrupt president hiding in his palace in the capital city, thought about the conspiracy he had uncovered and the lies that kept the whole world trapped in fear and ignorance, and he thought about the ancient memory he had seen of demons and monsters being deliberately summoned to keep people weak and desperate. His system had shown him visions of a demon lord that was even now gathering its forces for a massive attack that would coincide with the president's plans to seize even more power, and Kang-Ho realized that he had the strength and the army to end both threats at the same time if he acted quickly and decisively. He raised his shovel high above his head, and the entire army fell silent and turned to face him, waiting for the command that would send them marching toward the capital city and toward a battle that would determine the future of the entire world. Kang-Ho felt no fear or doubt in his heart, only a burning certainty that what he was about to do was right and necessary, that the boy who had been called worthless and laughed at and sent away to dig graves was going to save a world that had never believed in him, and that by the time the sun rose tomorrow, everyone would know that the greatest hero of this age was not some gold-rank knight or sacred priestess or sword saint, but was instead a level 95 grave digger who had learned to turn death itself into the most powerful force for good that the world had ever seen.